The night was cold and still, the kind of silence that seems to press against the walls of a small shed on the edge of Anchorage, Alaska. Inside that shed, behind an unassuming family home, Israel Keys was living out a secret life that no one around him suspected. To the neighbors, he was a quiet contractor, a father who seemed involved in his daughter's world, someone who blended into the background of daily routines. But in reality, he was one of the most calculating killers the United States had ever seen. For more than a decade, Keys moved across the country, choosing victims at random, killing far from home, and leaving almost nothing behind. He buried caches of weapons and tools years before he would use them. He stalked strangers without pattern, avoided leaving traces, and returned to his normal life as though nothing had happened. His crimes stretched from Washington to Vermont to Alaska, and perhaps beyond, leaving investigators with a chilling realization. They may never know the full number of lives he took. The TLDR is simple and terrifying. Israel Keys was a man who hid in plain sight. A father, a soldier, a contractor, and a killer. He murdered quietly, methodically, and without remorse. His victims were ordinary people, a young barista working the night shift, a married couple asleep in their home, and many more who remain unidentified. His story ends with his capture in 2012, but not with justice, because before he could face trial, he took his own life, leaving behind unanswered questions, grieving families, and mysteries that still haunt investigators to this day. But behind that chilling overview is a story of contradictions. How someone could appear so normal while living a life built on secrecy and horror. To understand how he reached that point, we have to go back to the beginning, to a childhood defined by isolation, control, and the first stirrings of violence. Israel Keys was born on January 7th, 1978 in Cove, Utah, the second of 10 children in a strict and deeply religious family. His parents, John and Heidi, raised their children in a world that rejected modern life, modern conveniences, and modern values. When Israel was still young, they uprooted the family and moved north to Washington State, settling deep in the woods outside the town of Colville. Their home was not a house in the conventional sense, but a small cabin with no running water, no electricity, and no connection to the modern comforts other families took for granted. Life there was rigid and demanding. The children rose early each morning to complete chores, chopping wood, hauling water, and tending to the garden and livestock. Their world revolved around work, survival, and obedience. Schooling was minimal and focused almost entirely on scripture. Entertainment was virtually non-existent. There were no televisions, no radios, and no casual friendships with neighborhood kids. The Keys family kept to themselves and discouraged outside influence. The isolation was more than physical. Their parents reinforced a worldview rooted in suspicion and distrust. Outsiders were considered dangerous, modern society corrupt, and authority figures unworthy of respect. The family became connected with a fringe religious movement tied loosely to the Christian identity ideology, which carried with it extreme and separatist beliefs. Within that bubble, the children grew up learning to see the outside world as both a threat and a temptation. For Israel, the isolation carved out a strange personality. He was quiet but observant, often slipping into the woods alone for hours at a time. These solitary trips became the backdrop for his earliest experiments with violence. Years later, in chilling detail, he admitted that as a boy he tied a neighbor's cat to a tree and shot it, watching as it died slowly. He described the experience without remorse, saying it made him feel powerful. This was no ordinary childhood mischief. It was a glimpse of the calculated detachment that would define his adult life. Inside the cabin, emotions were discouraged. His father's authority was absolute, his mother's devotion unbending, and the children learned quickly to suppress what they felt. Israel became adept at hiding his true self, presenting only what was expected. This was the beginning of his ability to wear masks, a skill he would later perfect as an adult. By his teenage years, Israel had already rejected much of what his parents had tried to instill in him. He openly renounced religion, declaring himself an atheist, a move that created rifts in the family. Yet even as he broke away ideologically, the lessons of control, secrecy, and compartmentalization remained etched into him. The foundation for his double life was already laid. Israel Keyes enlisted in the United States Army in 1998, a 19-year-old who had grown up off the grid and wanted a life that looked nothing like the one he left behind. The Army gave him exactly what he needed: structure without sermons, rules he could follow for clear rewards, space from the beliefs that had fenced his childhood. He learned to move with purpose, to carry weight mile after mile, to keep gear squared away, to clean a weapon until metal shone. Field exercises taught him patience. Long hours in the cold taught him how to wait without losing focus. He spent time at Fort Lewis in Washington and later at Fort Hood in Texas. In the barracks, he came off as steady and competent. He kept his bunk tight and his uniform sharp. He drank hard on weekends like plenty of others and then snapped back to routine on Monday without complaint. People remembered him as quiet but not shy, a guy who would nod and listen and then drift back into his own head. Nothing about him screamed trouble. That was the point. The Army also gave him habits he would twist into weapons later. He learned to plan backward from an objective. He learned to set up redundancies so failure in one step did not collapse the whole mission. He learned to be comfortable with maps and timelines and checklists. In training, you move from phase to phase and leave no trace where you do not need one. He internalized that lesson. He left the service in 2001 with an honorable discharge and a toolkit of skills that translated perfectly into civilian construction. He could measure twice and cut once. He could read a blueprint. He could be where he said he would be at 7 in the morning and work through the day without a fuss. He took jobs, saved money, and kept things tidy. From the outside, he looked like a man building a simple life one project at a time. Under that surface, the other life took form. He began traveling more widely than his work required. He liked the anonymity of airports and rental counters. He learned to fly into one state and then drive hundreds of miles in a direction that had nothing to do with his ticket. He preferred to pay in cash when he could. He turned phones off or left them behind. He kept receipts that made sense if anyone ever asked and got rid of anything that did not. During these years, he started burying what investigators later called kill kits, 5-gallon buckets sealed against moisture and dirt. Inside, he placed a handgun or a rifle part, boxes of ammunition, a roll of duct tape, cable ties, a headlamp, gloves, a shovel or folding entrenching tool, sometimes bottles of Drano or other chemicals, and cash. He buried them near trailheads, in woods behind culverts, along riverbanks that did not flood off, and in places he could find in the dark. It was preparation spread across years, the way a builder stages materials before a job begins. The kit waiting underground meant he did not have to carry incriminating gear across state lines. It also meant he could strike on a schedule only he knew. Back home, he wore the mask of a man settling down. He began a small contracting company in Anchorage, Alaska, took on roofing and remodel work, and built a reputation for showing up when he said he would. He lived with a girlfriend. He drove his daughter to school. He grocery shopped and waved to neighbors and cleared snow from a driveway after a storm. He blended. That was not an accident. He practiced it. Travel became the seam between the two lives. He would plan a job and a trip in the same calendar so one could explain the other. He would leave on a Thursday, pass through an airport where no one knew his face, and sit in an aisle seat with a paperback open and headphones in. He watched the way other people moved and filed away what made them careless. He rented cars he could disappear in. He chose colors that did not turn heads. He wore baseball caps that looked like every other cap in the lot. He did not hunt the way many killers do. He did not choose a type. He did not build a shrine to a victim or return to a specific street to stalk someone whose name he knew. He picked locations first and people second. He chose places where he had already buried a kid and then looked for opportunity. A home with a sliding door not quite latched. A couple with routines predictable enough to map in a notebook. A business that closed late with one young worker locking up alone. The distance between his home life and the place he chose to strike was the gap he relied on most. That gap kept jurisdictional lines between him and whoever would eventually discover the crime. He trained himself to be patient inside that gap. He could arrive in a town and wait 2 days if the weather was wrong or if a street felt too busy. He could sit in a parked car with the seat leaned back and let hours drip past until the clock finally lined up with the plan he carried in his head. He slept in cheap motels or in the car itself and woke with the same flat calm. Back in Anchorage, he returned to routine. He billed clients. He cut lumber clean and carried sheets of plywood up ladders without complaint. He made dinner. He read bedtime stories. He put on the face he had practiced since childhood, the one that showed what he wanted people to see and nothing more. By the late 2000s, a system he built ran on muscle memory. Cash in the ground. Ticket purchased. Car rented. Drive far. Act. Leave. Fly home. The absence of a personal motive was the point. It meant there were no obvious dots to connect, no jealous ex-boyfriend, no coworker with a grudge, no neighbor with a noisy dispute. He designed his life so any investigator would look everywhere except at him. The mask held for years. It would crack only when he took a risk close to home and broke the distance that had always protected him. Before that night came, one earlier trip across the country showed investigators how far he was willing to go to keep control. That trip led to a quiet street in Vermont and a couple asleep in their bed. In June 2011, Israel Keyes set out on one of his most carefully staged trips. By then, he had already perfected the rhythm of his crimes. He had buried a kid years earlier in Vermont, knowing eventually he would circle back. That year, he flew into Chicago, rented a car, and drove more than 1,000 miles east. To anyone passing him on the highway, he was another man behind the wheel, radio low, window cracked, eyes steady on the dotted lines. The target was not chosen in advance. That was part of his method. He did not stalk an individual. He stalked possibility. In the small city of Essex, Vermont, he found it. Bill and Lorraine Currier lived in a modest home on a quiet street. They were in their 50s, both steady workers, both part of a life that did not draw attention. Bill worked maintenance at a medical center. Lorraine worked at a local school. They had no known enemies, no reason to expect danger. But to Israel Keyes, that ordinariness was the opening. On the night of June 8th, 2011, he parked near their house and moved through the dark with his kid in hand. He cut the phone line outside to silence any call for help. Then he slipped through a garage window and into the house. Upstairs, Bill and Lorraine slept, unaware of the shadow moving below. They woke to the beam of flashlight in the shape of a masked man with a gun. He tied them quickly and told them what to do in a voice that did not raise or crack. He forced them into their own car and drove them away. The road stretched into the night toward an abandoned farmhouse he had scouted earlier, a sagging building hidden by trees and distance. Inside that farmhouse, he separated them. Bill tried to resist. He lunged. He fought with the weight of someone desperate to save the woman he loved. Keyes shot him and left his body. Lorraine he assaulted, then strangled, leaving her as well. When he walked out of the farmhouse and locked the car behind him, he left 2 lives ended and no one who knew where to look. Days later, family members realized something was wrong. Bill did not show up for work. Lorraine missed her shift. Calls went unanswered. Police entered the house and found signs of a struggle. A window forced, broken glass, items out of place. The couple's car was missing. The investigation opened, but with no clear suspect and no motive, it stalled almost immediately. Months turned to years. The farmhouse where they had died was demolished, rubble carried away, and soil scraped clean. By the time investigators learned the truth from Keyes himself, there was nothing left to recover. Bill and Lorraine Currier's bodies were gone forever. For detectives trying to understand Keyes' pattern, the Currier murders became a case study. He had driven across state lines, used a kit hidden years earlier, chosen a couple at random, and left without a single tie back to his home in Alaska. The distance, the randomness, and the preparation made it nearly impossible to connect him. Only later, after his arrest, would investigators realize that this was exactly the point. To Israel Keyes, unpredictability was the shield. By refusing to follow the familiar path of most serial killers, by avoiding a type of victim, by moving across jurisdictions, he made himself invisible. Back in Alaska, he resumed life as if nothing had happened. He met clients, sent invoices, cooked dinners, drove his daughter to school, and lived inside the mask that never cracked. Behind that mask, though, he carried the calm certainty that he could do it again whenever he wanted. What he did not know was that within a year he would break his own system, strike too close to home, and finally expose the secret life he had spent more than a decade perfecting. That failure came not in Vermont or Washington or New York, but on an ordinary winter night in Anchorage, Alaska. On February 1st, 2012, Anchorage was buried under the weight of another long Alaskan winter. The sun had set before most people even left work, and by nightfall the city was a patchwork of dim streetlights, neon signs, and the glow of headlights cutting through falling snow. Samantha Koenig, 18 years old, worked the evening shift at a small coffee stand called Common Grounds. It sat alone in a parking lot, the kind of place customers pulled through for a quick latte before merging back into traffic. Inside the stand, the space was tight, just enough room for an espresso machine, a cash drawer, and a young barista passing the time on a slow night. Samantha was bright, witty, and like so many teenagers, she carried the restless energy of someone on the cusp of adulthood. Friends described her as outspoken and funny, never afraid to say what she thought. She was making plans for her future, juggling the typical strains of school, work, and relationships. She had dreams beyond that little coffee shack. But on that night, her world narrowed to the quiet hum of machines and the snow falling outside the window. A little after 8 p.m., a man approached the stand. He looked like any other customer, bundled in winter clothing, face partly obscured by a ski mask, hands in pockets. Samantha greeted him through the sliding window, expecting to hear an order. Instead, she saw the black shape of a gun in his hand. He ordered her to turn off the lights. What followed lasted only minutes, but altered everything. Surveillance cameras captured pieces of it. Samantha complied, trying to stay calm, but fear flickered across her face. The man forced his way inside, zip-tied her wrists, and led her out into the snow. Outside, a white pickup truck idled. He pushed her inside, shut the door, and drove away. Just like that, Samantha was gone. When she failed to return home, her boyfriend and father grew worried. By morning, panic set in. Calls went unanswered. Police were contacted. Soon, posters appeared across Anchorage with Samantha's photograph. A smiling teenager with long brown hair. A familiar face in a community small enough that nearly everyone felt connected. Vigils were held. Friends and strangers gathered with candles, hoping she would come home. Behind the scenes, investigators pieced together what little evidence they had. The surveillance footage showed her being led away by a masked man, but the image was too dark and grainy to identify him. There was no license plate visible, no clear trail to follow. The case drew attention quickly because of Samantha's age, her vulnerability, and the brazenness of the abduction. Anchorage was used to crime, but not like this. Not the sudden vanishing of a teenager from a public place. What no one knew was that Samantha had been taken less than a mile from her own home. The man who held her captive was Israel Keys. He had broken his own rules that night. He had always planned his murders far from where he lived. He had always insisted on distance, randomness, and patience. But something in him shifted. He wanted the immediacy, the control, the risk. Samantha became his victim because she was there, working alone, and because he wanted to prove to himself he could still command every step of the process. In the hours after the abduction, he kept her bound in his shed, only yards away from where his girlfriend and daughter slept inside the house. The brazenness of it was staggering. He carried on as if nothing were wrong, preparing for a trip he had already scheduled, leaving her trapped in the dark while he packed. Then he did something even more chilling. He left for New Orleans to go on a pre-planned cruise with his family, leaving Samantha's fate suspended in that shed while Anchorage searched for her. Days passed. The Koenig family pleaded for her return. Volunteers combed streets and fields. Flyers multiplied. Police fielded hundreds of tips. No one guessed that the girl everyone prayed for had never left the city, that she was hidden in plain sight by a man who went about his life with perfect calm. Keys returned from his cruise weeks later and carried out the rest of his plan. He killed Samantha and staged her body to appear alive in a ransom photo. He sewed her eyelids open with fishing line and posed her, holding a recent newspaper as proof of life. Then he typed a ransom note demanding money be deposited into Samantha's account. The photograph circulated, giving her family false hope that she might still be alive. Money was deposited, and Keys began to make withdrawals using Samantha's debit card. Surveillance footage caught a man in a mask at ATMs across the Southwest, drawing small amounts of cash. Each new sighting moved the search further away from Alaska into states like Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. Investigators chased the trail, alert to each withdrawal, waiting for the mistake that would finally reveal his identity. That mistake came in March 2012 in the town of Lufkin, Texas. A state trooper spotted a white Ford Focus matching the description of the rental connected to the ATM withdrawals. Inside was Israel Keys. He was arrested without a fight. In the car, police FO. Back in Anchorage, the truth began to surface. Under questioning, Keys admitted what he had done. He led investigators to Matanuska Lake, where he had cut a hole in the ice and sunk Samantha's body. Divers recovered her remains on April 2nd, 2012. The city that had held vigils now held funerals. For Anchorage, the shock was overwhelming. This was not a crime committed by a stranger passing through. It was the work of a man who lived among them, who owned a business, who had waved to neighbors, who had gone on cruises and attended school events while hiding a secret life of murder. The mask had finally cracked, but only because he chose to gamble close to home. When Israel Keys was taken into custody in March 2012, investigators at first believed they had solved only one horrific crime, the abduction and murder of Samantha Koenig. But very quickly they realized they had stumbled into something far larger, something they had never encountered before. Keys was calm, almost clinical in his responses. He admitted to the Koenig murder with a bluntness that unnerved even seasoned agents. And then, without hesitation, he hinted at more. In the quiet of interrogation rooms, he told them that Samantha was not his first victim. He described a life of compartmentalization, of keeping one part of himself perfectly ordinary and another part dedicated to murder. He said he had killed across the country. He said there were many, though he refused to give numbers. He made clear he would never give up names unless he felt it benefited him. The agents listened as he explained the system he had built. He would fly into one city, rent a car, and drive hundreds of miles. He would dig up a kit he had hidden years earlier, filled with weapons, restraints, and cash. He would search for an opportunity, a home with easy access, a person walking alone, and strike. He would leave the scene, drive back to the airport, fly home, and slide seamlessly into his role as father, contractor, and neighbor. What made Keyes extraordinary was his lack of a pattern. Serial killers often target a specific type of victim: young women, sex workers, runaways. Investigators build profiles based on those choices, but Keyes selected at random. He told them he preferred it that way. He wanted victims who had no connection to him, no link that could be traced. That randomness made him nearly invisible. As interrogations stretched on, Keyes began to reveal glimpses of his crimes. He admitted to killing a couple in Vermont, Bill and Lorraine Currier. He told the FBI he had broken into their home, abducted them, and murdered them in an abandoned farmhouse. Their bodies had never been found, and by the time he confessed, the building had already been demolished. The confession confirmed what their families had long suspected, but it brought no closure, only the permanent absence of remains. He spoke vaguely about other victims. He said he had killed 4 people in Washington state, but he gave no names. He mentioned crimes in New York and Texas, possibly in other states as well. He admitted to bank robberies, to burglaries, to arsons committed for practice and distraction. He told investigators he liked the feeling of planning, of being in control, of bending circumstances to his will. When agents pressed him for specifics, he was evasive. He enjoyed the power of dangling information without giving full answers. He teased details, then pulled back. He played with timelines. He offered fragments of truth, leaving investigators to piece them together. The interviews became a battle of patience. What stood out most was his detachment. He described murders the way a carpenter might describe building a table, step by step, tool by tool. There was no remorse, no emotion. Even when discussing Samantha Koenig, he spoke as though she were an object in a plan, not a human being. His calm tone chilled the agents across the table. The FBI began tracing his travels, pulling records from airlines, rental car companies, and credit card statements. They mapped his movements over years and realized he had covered vast stretches of the United States. Every trip became a question mark. Did he bury a kit there? Did he kill there? They followed up on missing persons cases, unsolved murders, unexplained disappearances. The list grew. What made it worse was the realization that they might never know the full scope. Keyes had taken extraordinary measures to avoid detection. He chose victims at random, killed far from home, left bodies in places unlikely to be found, and returned to his normal life. Without his confessions, many of his crimes would never have been connected. Family members of the Keyes and the Koenigs sat in courtrooms and press conferences, hearing pieces of his admissions, trying to process the scale of what he had done. For them, each word was a reminder of lives stolen and futures erased. By the time the interrogations ended, the FBI believed Israel Keyes had killed at least 11 people, possibly far more. He gave them no full list. He left them with fragments, hints, and silences. In those silences lingered the possibility that victims remained undiscovered, names unknown, families still searching. For investigators, the challenge became not only to document what he confessed, but to build a picture of what he had never revealed. That task would continue long after Keyes himself was gone. For those who studied Israel Keyes after his arrest, one question rose above the rest. How could a man live such an ordinary life on the surface while carrying out some of the most chilling crimes in modern memory? The answer lay in his ability to compartmentalize, to divide himself into separate rooms and never let one bleed into the other. Psychologists who reviewed his case noted that he built walls inside his own mind. In one room was the father who tucked his daughter in at night, the contractor who handed invoices to clients, the neighbor who waved from a driveway. In another was the predator who buried kill kits across the country, who studied potential victims with cold calculation, who could abduct and murder without hesitation. Between those rooms was a locked door, one he alone held the key to. This ability had roots in his childhood. Growing up in isolation, in a family that taught secrecy and distrust, he learned early to hide what he thought and felt. His father demanded obedience, his mother insisted on rigid faith, and Israel discovered that silence was a shield. He carried that shield into adulthood, learning to present exactly what people expected while concealing what he wanted most. The Army sharpened those skills. Military life demanded discipline, compartmentalization, and the ability to endure discomfort without complaint. Keyes excelled at that. He could function in harsh conditions, keep calm under stress, and complete a task with precision. When he left the service, he carried those abilities into civilian life, bending them toward a far darker purpose. Friends and acquaintances described him as quiet, reliable, even friendly in small doses. He attended school events with his daughter. He fixed fences and roofs for clients who praised his work ethic. He drank beer with friends, laughed at jokes, and listened when others spoke. Nothing in his day-to-day interactions revealed the violence inside him. That mask of normalcy was deliberate. He practiced it, refined it, and relied on it. Psychologists debated what kind of man he truly was. Some believed he was a psychopath in a classic sense, devoid of empathy, driven by control, incapable of remorse. Others argued he was something more complex, a man who could feel attachment in certain contexts, but who deliberately chose to sever that attachment when it suited him. He seemed capable of caring for his daughter, of wanting her to succeed, but he was equally capable of vanishing across the country and ending the lives of strangers without a flicker of conscience. During interviews with the FBI, Keyes sometimes smiled when describing his methods. He seemed to enjoy the power of controlling the narrative, of holding information only he could decide to release. That smile unsettled investigators. It was not the smile of a nervous man. It was the smile of someone who believed he was still in control, even while handcuffed to a table. The contrast between the mask and the reality was perhaps most visible in Anchorage. Neighbors saw him as a man who mowed his lawn, shoveled snow, and took his daughter camping. His girlfriend believed he was a reliable partner. His clients thought he was trustworthy with their homes. And yet only feet away, in a shed behind his house, he held Samantha Koenig captive. That ability to place horror alongside routine without allowing one to disturb the other was what made him so dangerous. Investigators called him meticulous. They said he was unlike other killers because he did not seek recognition, did not want trophies, did not crave headlines. He wanted control. He wanted the act itself. And once it was done, he wanted to erase it from his surface life, tucking it behind the locked door in his mind. It is this psychology that still unsettles those who studied him. Most killers reveal themselves over time through patterns, escalating behavior, or slips in their facade. Keyes built a life that was patternless on purpose, a system designed to make him invisible. It was only his decision to break his own rules, to act close to home with Samantha Koenig, that shattered the mask. Without that mistake, investigators admit he might never have been caught. As the FBI unraveled the fragments of Israel Keyes' confessions, one reality became painfully clear. They might never know the true number of his victims. Keyes himself admitted as much. In the sterile quiet of interview rooms, he told them there were less than a dozen, then in other moments suggested more. He spoke of victims in Washington, of crimes in New York, of travels through Arizona, Texas, and California. He spoke of bank robberies carried out not for money, but for thrill and practice. Each admission opened a door to possibilities investigators could not fully close. What haunted them most were gaps. He gave enough detail to confirm some killings, like that of Bill and Lorraine Currier in Vermont. He spoke with confidence about burying kill kits across the country, naming riversides and rural fields where he had left sealed buckets of weapons and cash. When agents dug at some of those sites, they found exactly what he described: buckets preserved in the earth, tools waiting for use. That confirmation meant his other stories likely carried truth as well. But without names, without dates, without specific locations, those truths remained shadows. In Washington state, where Keyes lived for years before moving to Alaska, investigators reviewed dozens of unsolved cases. Families who had lost loved ones long ago wondered if their names were among his hidden tally. He admitted to at least 4 murders in that state, but he refused to give details. In New York, he hinted at another killing, perhaps near the Adirondacks. In Texas, he suggested more. But again, he closed the door before stepping fully through it. The randomness of his choices made the search harder. Most serial killers leave investigators a thread to follow, a type of victim or a signature left at the scene. Keyes avoided that on purpose. He chose strangers whose routines intersected his opportunity. He preferred couples, he said, because controlling 2 people gave him more of a challenge. But he did not limit himself to that. He admitted to killing alone when the chance was easier. The FBI assembled a timeline of his travels, mapping flights, rental car records, and ATM transactions. The map spread like a spider web across the United States. Each line between cities was a corridor of suspicion. Each stop became a possible crime scene. They reached out to local police departments, cross-checked with missing persons, reopened cold cases. For every confirmed detail, there were dozens more left uncertain. Families across the country listened to the news with heavy hearts. Some wondered if the disappearance of their daughter or son, unsolved for years, might connect to this man who traveled in silence and killed in shadows. But Keyes gave them nothing. He said he had no interest in helping close cases. He would only talk on his own terms, and even then he spoke in fragments. This refusal created a torment that lingers still. Investigators know there are victims who will never be named, bodies that will never be recovered, families who will never have certainty. The truth exists only in Keyes' memory, and that memory died with him. The case of Israel Keyes stands apart from others not only because of his crimes, but because of how little is known for certain. Most serial killers are eventually linked to their full number of victims or close to it. Keyes ensured his secrets would remain secrets. The kill kits buried across states were proof of his long-term planning. But without him to point to the specific places he used them, the evidence remains buried in silence. The unanswered questions are perhaps the darkest legacy he left behind. How many lives did he take? How many families still search for answers without realizing their lost ties back to him? Which towns hold shadows of his passing, never to be connected to his name? These questions weigh heavily on those who studied him, and on those who lived through the pain of disappearance. For the families of the Keyes, of Samantha Koenig, and for the unnamed others, closure remains out of reach. Keyes ensured it would be that way. He designed his life so that the truth would vanish with him, leaving only fragments behind. After his arrest in March 2012, Israel Keys was transferred back to Anchorage to await trial. On paper, he faced charges for the abduction and murder of Samantha Koenig, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. But for investigators, the trial was not the main focus. They wanted answers to the broader mystery. How many others had he killed? And were their bodies? They hoped months of questioning would break through his walls. In custody, Keys was kept under close watch, but he remained unervingly calm. Guards and fellow inmates described him as quiet, polite, even cooperative when he chose to be. He followed routines without fuss, eating meals, exercising in his cell, reading books. He projected an air of control, as though incarceration was just another environment he had adapted to. During interrogations, he maintained that same control. He gave fragments of information, confirming what investigators already suspected, but withholding anything beyond it. He hinted at more murders, teased the possibility of additional states, but never delivered names or precise locations. For him, the power lay in withholding. He knew families were waiting. He knew agents were desperate, and he savored that position. Months dragged on. The Koenig family braced for the trial that would bring them face to face with the man who had taken their daughter. The Currier family tried to process the confirmation of their loved one's fate, knowing their remains were gone forever. Across the country, whispers spread of possible victims tied to his travels. But on December 2nd, 2012, Israel Keys ended his own story. Guards found him dead in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. He had slit his wrists and strangled himself with a sheet. He left behind a long handwritten note, smeared with blood. The note was not a confession. It gave no names, no numbers, no locations. Instead, it was a rambling, dark poem filled with imagery of death, murder, and destruction. It spoke of souls collected, of a hunger that could never be satisfied. It offered no closure to families, no details for investigators, no resolution for the public. It was a final act of control, denying everyone the answers they needed. His death stunned the case. For the Koenig family, it meant never seeing him face justice. For the Currier family, it meant never learning the final details of what had happened to Bill and Lorraine. For countless other families with missing loved ones, it meant the possibility of never knowing if Keys was responsible. Investigators scrambled to salvage what they could. They reviewed every scrap of evidence from his home, his shed, his computer. They pored over his financial records, his flight logs, his rental car receipts. They cross-checked with missing persons databases, hoping to link him to cases that fit his movements. They found suggestions, possible matches, but nothing definitive. Without his cooperation, the puzzle remained incomplete. In the end, Israel Keys took his secrets with him. He had lived a life designed around control, and in his death he ensured he kept that control. He left families in limbo, investigators frustrated, and a nation haunted by the knowledge that his true toll may never be known. When news broke that Israel Keys had taken his own life in his Anchorage cell, the reaction rippled across the country. For some, it was relief that he could never harm again. For others, it was rage that he had denied justice. For families of possible victims, it was despair, the realization that the only person who could confirm their suspicions had silenced himself forever. The Koenig family carried the heaviest grief. They had already endured weeks of agonizing uncertainty. The ransom note, the staged photograph, the cruel discovery of Samantha's body beneath the ice. They had steeled themselves for a trial that would force them to hear the details of her last hours. Instead, they were left with an empty courtroom and a handwritten suicide note that spoke of nothing but darkness. For them, closure was ripped away at the last moment. The Currier family faced a different pain. They had at least been given confirmation of what had happened to Bill and Lorraine, but with no bodies to lay to rest, no chance to face Keyes in court, their grief became an unending ache. The demolished farmhouse where the couple had been killed was gone. The land had been cleared. The place of their last moments was erased. All that remained were words from a killer who offered no remorse. Other families across the country looked at his death with hollow eyes. Parents of missing sons and daughters, husbands of missing wives, siblings of those who had vanished without explanation. They wondered if Keyes had been the one. Some reached out to investigators, desperate to connect the dots. Without Keyes' cooperation, those connections rarely came. For the FBI, his death was a devastating setback. They had spent months probing his secrets, slowly piecing together a map of his travels, hoping to extract names. With him gone, they turned instead to the evidence left behind. His kill kits became central. Agents dug up buried buckets in Alaska, New York, and Vermont, proving his claims were real. They used his travel records to highlight windows of time that matched unsolved cases. But the uncertainty remained. In the years since, Israel Keyes has remained a subject of fascination and dread. His case is taught to criminologists as an example of a killer who defied patterns. His methods are analyzed in FBI training sessions as a warning of how hard it could be to catch someone who plans so carefully and acts so randomly. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and books return to his story again and again, not because it is solved, but because it is not. He is remembered less for who he was as a person and more for what he represented. A predator hidden in plain sight, a man who seemed ordinary but lived in secret shadows. His name sits alongside others in the dark history of American crime, but with a difference. With Ted Bundy, investigators eventually tallied the victims. With John Wayne Gacy, they exhumed bodies. With Keyes, the number remains unknown. The legacy of Israel Keyes is not just the pain he inflicted, but the questions he left behind. Every time a family wonders if their missing loved one crossed his path, every time a cold case is reopened because of his travel records, every time his words are reviewed for clues, those questions keep his shadow alive. And yet, in Anchorage, life moved forward. The coffee stand where Samantha worked was eventually torn down. The shed behind his home stood empty, a reminder of what had been hidden there. For his daughter, his family, and the families of his victims, the wounds remain. The story of Israel Keyes does not end with the cold walls of his Anchorage cell or the blood-smeared note he left behind. It continues in the echoes that ripple outward. Criminologists still debate how someone could design a life so ordinary while using it as cover for a secret trail of destruction. FBI case studies still point to his ability to defy profiles, to travel wide, to strike without pattern. He became an example not of how a killer was caught, but how close the system came to never catching him at all. In popular culture, his name has appeared in documentaries, long-form articles, and episodes of true crime television. His methods are dissected, his interviews replayed, his smile in those interrogation rooms frozen on screens as a reminder of the mask he wore so well. For many, his story is unsettling not because of gore or spectacle, but because of the banality. He was a father packing lunches, a contractor fixing roofs, a man who stood in line at hardware stores. And beneath that, he was something else entirely. For the families, none of that analysis brings peace. For the Koenigs, for the Kias, and for those unnamed victims whose lives were taken in silence, the story is one of absence. A daughter who never came home. A couple who never opened their front door again. A list of names never spoken. Families who still wonder. The shadow Keyes cast stretches further than even investigators can measure. In the end, the questions may be more powerful than the answers. How many lives did he end? How many towns hold secrets that will never be unearthed? How many families still wait for closure that will not come? Israel Keyes designed his crimes so that these questions would remain. In that sense, his legacy is not just in what he did, but in what he hid. And so our story comes to a close. The life of Israel Keyes is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who blend in best, who live next door, who pass by unnoticed in the rhythm of everyday life. His mask is gone now, but the mystery remains. Thank you for listening to this story of Israel Keyes. If you found this one compelling, and if you want more stories that explore the dark corners of crime in a calm and thoughtful way, feel free to listen to more captivating stories right here on this channel. For now, rest easy and good night.